What we are witnessing, with rockets launched from Yemen striking high-rise towers in Tel Aviv, is far more than a tactical escalation, and it signals a systemic shift in how peripheral conflicts can implicate central power structures. Think about it. A rebel actor in the Arabian Peninsula using increasingly sophisticated missiles hits urban Israel. That's a message sent not just to Tel Aviv, but to the entire region and to the major powers behind it. The hook here is when war enters the towers of cities previously perceived as safe, the old rules change. This event forces us to ask who benefits from such a dramatic act. On one level, the Yemeni actors involved Project Strength, disruption, and relevance. On another level, the ripple effect destabilizes alliances, forces the Israeli state to divert resources from one front to another, and opens space for regional proxies to gain influence. The vox pop hook, when the weak hit the strong in the strong's backyard, the system shifts. In economic and political terms, that means the cost of empire, the cost of forward bases, the cost of regional military dominance becomes sharper. We must situate this within the larger global economy of war. The Israeli defense apparatus, backed by U.S. military industrial interests, now is forced into a less predictable environment. Every rocket that lands in a tower is a cost line. Reinforcement, insurance, reconstruction, alert status, economy disrupted. And yet, the deeper story is that for the Yemeni side, these strikes are a cheap way of raising their profile, projecting power, and altering the agenda. The hook. Asymmetry wins when cost is low and impact is high. Next, we should ask, what does this say about regional orders? The Middle East has been under a system where the dominant powers, Israel, the US, Saudi Arabia, occupy roles of control. But when actors in Yemen can reach Tel Aviv towers, the zones of control are eroding. You don't need full state armies. You need networks, missiles, and symbolic targets. The skyscraper becomes the new battlefield. The implication, the geography of power is shifting upward and inward. The hook. When your civilians live in towers, war lives in your living room. Economically, civilian infrastructure attacked means insurance premiums rise, investment dries up, foreign capital hesitates, tourism collapses, and the domestic economy suffers. For Israel, this means a further burden at a time when defense budgets and economic inequality already press inward. For Yemen, the narrative is one of disruption, desperation, and opportunity. The hook. War isn't only fought with bombs. It's fought by collapsing expectations of normality. Finally, we ask, what is the structural meaning for global capitalism? Every imperial project that depends on stability, forward bases, economic corridors, safe zones, is under threat when peripheral actors hit heartland targets. The system shows its vulnerability. The perimeter is porous. The cost of defense rises. The legitimacy of military dominance falls. The hook. The empire doesn't fall by its center collapsing. It falls by its periphery becoming central. So in sum, these rockets hitting towers in Tel Aviv are not just headline grabbing. They are structural signals. They expose the fragility of power, the asymmetry of modern war, the economic fallout of urban conflict, and the shifting geography of global order. And they force us to rethink: if towers can be hit, what remains safe? The Yemeni rocket strikes on Tel Aviv's towers mark more than just a regional flashpoint. They represent a profound structural shift in the architecture of global power. For decades, the geopolitical order has been built on the assumption that military might and technological superiority grant security to dominant nations and their allies. What these strikes demonstrate is that the monopoly on reach, precision, and deterrence has fractured. When a non state or semi state actor from one of the poorest nations on earth can project force into the urban core of one of the most technologically advanced militaries, it signals the end of unipolar security. Power is decentralizing, and that decentralization is changing the rules of global engagement. This moment underscores a historical reversal. Traditionally, wars were fought in peripheries, colonial frontiers, borderlands, and buffer zones, while the metropolitan centers remained insulated. Today, the peripheries are striking back at the metropoles, using affordable technology and global communication networks to turn symbolic attacks into instruments of influence. Tel Aviv's skyline, once a marker of prosperity and deterrence, becomes a message board for global audiences. No city, however secure, is beyond the reach of modern resistance. This is not simply a military event. It is a cultural and psychological rupture that challenges the very premise of centralized power. Economically, the impact extends beyond immediate destruction. Such strikes erode investor confidence, weaken the perceived stability of the region, and expose the vulnerabilities of global markets dependent on uninterrupted flows of capital and logistics. The ability of smaller actors to disrupt these flows, even momentarily, redistributes leverage. Where once power was measured in GDP, weapons, stockpiles, and alliances, it now includes the capacity to destabilize and the ability to command global attention at minimal cost. In strategic terms, this shift forces major powers to rethink deterrence itself. The old model, overwhelming retaliation, no longer guarantees security when the aggressor operates from dispersed, unpredictable networks rather than conventional armies. This development mirrors broader trends in the global economy: the diffusion of production, communication, and now warfare. The center is losing its privilege of safety. Every skyscraper, every financial hub, every digital nerve becomes part of the battlefield. The world's political order is no longer defined by who holds the largest arsenal, but by who can adapt fastest to a world where influence flows horizontally, not vertically. The Yemeni rocket strikes on Tel Aviv reveal a central truth about modern geopolitics. Empires are no longer brought down by rival superpowers, but by the accumulated costs of managing resistance from smaller, more adaptive adversaries. Asymmetric warfare, the ability of weaker actors to exploit the vulnerabilities of stronger ones, has redefined the economic and political calculus of power. It is no longer about who can build the most advanced weapons, but about who can impose the higher cost of engagement. When Yemen, a nation devastated by years of blockade and war, can strike a modern metropolis, it forces powerful states to confront an uncomfortable reality. Technological superiority cannot shield them from strategic exhaustion. This form of warfare thrives on imbalance. The weaker side does not seek parity, it seeks disruption. A few missiles launched at minimal expense that can provoke billion-dollar responses, new defense systems, emergency deployments, reconstruction projects, market instability. Each reaction drains the empire's treasury and fractures its illusion of control. For Israel and its allies, every interception or retaliatory strike is not only a display of strength, but also a demonstration of how costly that strength has become. The economic burden of permanent readiness, the radar systems, the alert protocols, the insurance hikes begins to outweigh the tactical advantage of dominance. In economic terms, asymmetric warfare functions like attacks on empire. The constant need to defend against unpredictable, low cost threats erodes profitability, inflates budgets, and reshapes domestic politics. The cost of security translates into higher public spending, austerity elsewhere, and social tension at home. The empire pays twice, once for the war and once for the anxiety it creates among its own citizens. For nations dependent on foreign capital and stability, this fear translates into real losses, investors withdraw, trade slows, and reputational risk grows. Strategically, asymmetric conflict erodes the myth of deterrence. The weaker side knows it cannot win in conventional terms, but it doesn't need to. It only needs to keep fighting long enough to make the empire's dominance unsustainable. Each missile, each drone, each cyber attack adds to a mounting bill, economic, psychological, and political. The the empire's challenge is no longer victory, but endurance. And endurance is a cost that even the most powerful nations can only afford for so long. The strikes on Tel Aviv's towers mark a decisive transformation in the geography of warfare. For centuries, battlefields were confined to borders, deserts, seas, and distant provinces, spaces where civilian life could be separated from military conflict. But as rockets rain down on cities filled with civilians, commerce, and infrastructure, that boundary has vanished. The urban center, once the symbol of safety and progress, has become the new front line. In Tel Aviv, as in Kiev, Damascus, or Gaza, skyscrapers and apartment blocks are no longer neutral spaces. They are strategic targets, chosen not just for military value, but for the psychological and economic shock they deliver. The city itself becomes a weaponized environment, a dense network of human, digital, and economic systems vulnerable to disruption at every level. When rockets strike towers, the physical destruction is only the beginning. The deeper impact lies in how such attacks unravel the assumptions that hold modern societies together. The idea that cities represent stability, innovation, and security collapses under the weight of visible vulnerability. Citizens who once viewed war as something that happens elsewhere now find it exploding above their heads. That shift changes everything: how people invest, where they live, how they trust their governments to protect them. It creates a culture of fear and uncertainty that no missile shield can fully defend against. The skyscraper, once an emblem of human achievement, turns into a symbol of exposure, a vertical reminder of how fragile modern life really is. Economically, the urban battlefield generates cascading costs. Each attack disrupts communication networks, power grids, and financial centers, creating ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate blast zone. Tourism declines, businesses relocate, and insurance premiums skyrocket. Even without total destruction, the mere threat of attack alters the rhythm of daily life and the logic of investment. The city, designed to concentrate productivity, now concentrates risk. Strategically targeting urban centers represents a profound shift in warfare's objectives. The goal is not just to defeat armies, but to fracture societies, to make ordinary life itself unsustainable. When civilians, infrastructure, and global markets share the same space, every missile becomes a message that no fortress of steel and glass can guarantee safety. In this new era, the city's skyline is no longer a sign of power, but a map of vulnerability. The aftermath of the Yemeni rocket strikes on Tel Aviv reaches far beyond the shattered glass and smoke-filled streets. The true devastation lies in the invisible tremors that ripple through the economy, both domestically and globally. Modern warfare is no longer measured only in casualties or buildings destroyed. It is measured in stock market volatility, trade disruptions, and psychological uncertainty that undermines the very fabric of economic confidence. When a city like Tel Aviv, an economic hub powered by finance, technology, and innovation, comes under attack, the consequences stretch across sectors. Investors withdraw funds, global markets react with hesitation, and ordinary citizens begin to rethink their sense of stability. The strike becomes not just a military incident, but an economic contagion. The first impact is psychological, but immediately financial. Fear drives markets, and fear multiplies faster than any missile. Businesses suspend operations, foreign investors question the safety of their assets, and multinational companies quietly prepare exit strategies or delay expansion. Tourism collapses overnight. Insurance companies reassess premiums, and domestic consumption slows as citizens prioritize survival over spending. The economic rhythm of the city, the steady pulse of trade, investment, and mobility is disrupted. The cost of rebuilding physical structures becomes secondary to the loss of economic momentum. Moreover, these shocks compound over time. Governments respond by increasing defense spending and allocating emergency funds for reconstruction and compensation. These expenditures rarely come from surplus budgets. They are financed through debt, inflation, or cuts to social programs. The result is a redistribution of pain from the bomb towers to the public purse, from private corporations to the working population. Every new security checkpoint, every reinforced building, every round of air defense funding represents resources diverted from education, healthcare, and innovation. War's invisible ledger records its entries in unemployment, inequality, and austerity. The global implications amplify this fallout. International investors and supply chains, deeply interconnected with regional economies, begin to treat such events as systemic risks. A missile in Tel Aviv can unsettle markets in London, New York, or Tokyo, because global capitalism depends on the assumption of stability. Once that assumption is shaken, the cost of doing business rises everywhere. In this sense, a rocket strike is not just a weapon, it is an economic signal that reverberates through currencies, commodities, and credit systems, revealing how fragile prosperity becomes when war enters the financial core. The Yemeni rocket strikes on Tel Aviv highlight a critical erosion of traditional, regional, and global power hierarchies. For decades, the Middle East has been dominated by a few central powers: Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United States, whose military, economic, and political influence was largely uncontested. These actors could project force, secure borders, and dictate alliances with a sense of certainty. Yet when missiles from a peripheral actor reach the heart of Tel Aviv, the illusion of control shatters. The event exposes the growing impotence of traditional power brokers in containing conflict and maintaining order, signaling a fundamental recalibration in regional dynamics. The strikes demonstrate that control is no longer strictly geographic or numerical. The traditional metric of power, size of armies, quantity of weapons, or territorial dominance, is insufficient to guarantee security. Modern conflicts leverage asymmetry, surprise, and psychological impact. A few targeted strikes can disrupt the calculations of the region's most powerful states, forcing them to react defensively rather than strategically. This reactive posture diminishes authority and allows smaller actors to set the agenda, shaping political and diplomatic conversations from the margins rather than the centers of power. Globally, the implications are equally significant. Major powers depend on the perception that their allies and spheres of influence are stable. When cities like Tel Aviv are vulnerable, that perception weakens. This vulnerability challenges U.S. hegemony, questions the reliability of defense partnerships, and encourages regional actors to hedge to their bets. If traditional powers cannot guarantee protection, smaller states and non-state actors gain leverage, negotiating not from weakness, but from the power of disruption. The strike becomes a tool to assert relevance, demand attention, and force recalibration of alliances. Economically, the destabilization affects trade, investment, and regional development. Uncertainty discourages cross-border investment, delays projects, and increases the cost of risk mitigation. Governments must prioritize defense and crisis management over infrastructure, innovation, and social services over time. This reshapes the regional order. Power is no longer concentrated in established capitals or militaries, but dispersed across networks capable of exploiting vulnerabilities in asymmetric ways. The strike also signals a psychological shift. The perceived invulnerability of dominant powers has always been central to their authority. Once the periphery can directly strike the center, confidence erodes. Allies begin to question strategic commitments, and adversaries are emboldened. The traditional hierarchies that once structured diplomacy, military engagement, and economic planning are increasingly porous, demonstrating that the order maintained through dominance is no longer secure. The Yemeni rocket strikes on Tel Aviv illuminate a critical vulnerability in the global capitalist system: the fragility of interconnected economies and the illusion of centralized control. Modern capitalism depends on predictable supply chains, secure financial hubs, and stable geopolitical environments. Tel Aviv, as a center for finance, technology, and trade, exemplifies the nodes on which the system relies. When rockets strike such a city, the immediate physical destruction is secondary to the disruption of the complex web of economic activity that sustains global markets. In essence, what is attacked is not only a building or district, but a pillar of the capitalist infrastructure itself. The global capitalism functions on the assumption that risk is manageable and localized. Firms and investors calculate probabilities and contingencies based on historical patterns, political alliances, and defense capacities. However, asymmetric attacks like those from Yemen bypass these assumptions. A single missile can interrupt not only local commerce, but also international investment flows, technological development, and financial confidence. Insurance markets spike, venture capital retreats, and multinational corporations reconsider the safety of their operations. The cost is not just economic, it is structural, altering the expectations and behaviors that underpin global capitalism. Furthermore, the strikes expose the unequal distribution of vulnerability inherent in the system. While global capital can shift, diversify, and insure itself against risk, the human and social costs fall disproportionately on the local population. Civilians face the loss of homes, livelihoods, and public services, while corporations and investors primarily absorb financial adjustments. This disjunction reveals that capitalism's resilience is often more theoretical than practical. It can survive financial fluctuations, but struggles when its physical and social foundations are threatened. Strategically, the incident demonstrates that stability cannot be assumed from strength alone. The central nodes of global capitalism, the major cities, ports, and financial districts, are dependent on fragile networks of supply, energy, and information. A. Disruption in one node cascades outward, creating shocks across international markets. Yemen, with limited resources, leverages these vulnerabilities to punch above its weight, showing that power in the capitalist system is increasingly contingent on the ability to disrupt rather than to dominate. Psychologically, such events erode confidence in the system itself. When a peripheral actor can impose costs on the center of global economic activity, the perception of invulnerability is shattered. Investors, policymakers, and ordinary citizens begin to reconsider assumptions of security and continuity, forcing a reevaluation of risk, strategy, and priorities. The strike is, therefore, more than a military or political act. It is a structural signal that global capitalism, for all its sophistication, is deeply susceptible to disruption from unexpected and asymmetric pressures. What these events ultimately reveal is that the dynamics of power, security, and economics are no longer controlled solely by the largest states or the wealthiest actors. The ability of peripheral forces to strike the heart of modern cities forces us to confront a new reality. Stability is fragile, dominance is costly, and the old hierarchies of power are increasingly porous. In this era, understanding the interplay between asymmetric conflict, economic disruption, and social vulnerability is not optional. It is essential. The world we have built, interconnected and technologically advanced, is more resilient in some ways, but astonishingly exposed in others. How we respond to this exposure will define not only the balance of power in the Middle East, but the future architecture of global capitalism itself.